She wiped the grease from her hands with a worn rag, studying the classic 1967 Mustang that had been towed into her garage at closing time. The car was beautiful. Shelby GT500, Highland green with black racing stripes, but it had been sitting in use for what looked like decades. The elderly man who owned it had introduced himself simply as Frank and asked if she could get it running again. Maya Rodriguez had been restoring classic cars for 8 years, but something about this particular vehicle felt different. As she popped the hood and began her inspection, she discovered modifications that didn't belong in any civilian muscle car. Military-grade communication equipment hardwired into the electrical system, armor plating concealed beneath the body panels, and a hidden compartment containing documents that would make her hands shake when she read them. What Maya didn't know was that Frank was Colonel Frank Mitchell, reported missing in action 37 years ago, and the Mustang contained intelligence that could expose the biggest military cover-up in American history. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we dive into this extraordinary story of hidden identity, buried secrets, and a mechanic who stumbled onto the truth, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you believe that some secrets are too important to stay buried, hit that subscribe button to support stories that honor those who uncover the truth no matter the cost. Maya Rodriguez had inherited Rodriguez Classic Auto from her father 3 years ago, along with his reputation for being able to restore any vehicle back to its original glory. At 28, she had already established herself as one of the most skilled restoration specialists in Phoenix, Arizona, with a client list that included collectors, enthusiasts, and occasionally people who needed discretion more than they needed perfection. Her garage occupied a converted warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where she could work on multiple projects simultaneously without disturbing neighbors or attracting unwanted attention. The facility contained lifts, specialized tools, and equipment that had been accumulated over 2 generations of Rodriguez family automotive expertise. Maya's specialty was American muscle cars from the 1960s and 1970s, vehicles that required both mechanical expertise and historical knowledge to restore properly. She understood not just how these cars functioned, but how they were supposed to look, sound, and feel when they had rolled off the assembly line decades earlier. The Mustang arrived on a Tuesday evening in October, delivered by a towing service that had been paid in cash by the elderly man who followed the truck in a worn pickup. Maya's first impression of Frank Mitchell was that he seemed nervous in a way that went beyond normal concern about an expensive restoration project. "Ms. Rodriguez," Frank said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed despite his attempt to sound casual, "I've heard you're the best at bringing old cars back to life." Maya studied the Mustang as it was unloaded from the tow truck, noting details that immediately captured her professional interest. The car was a genuine 1967 Shelby GT500, one of the most sought-after muscle cars ever produced, but had been stored in conditions that had preserved it remarkably well despite decades of apparent neglect. "Mr. Mitchell, this is an exceptional vehicle," Maya replied, walking around the car and noting modifications that seemed inconsistent with standard Shelby specifications. "How long has it been since it was last driven?" Frank's hesitation before answering was slight, but noticeable. "It's been quite a while. I had to store it for an extended period due to circumstances beyond my control." Maya opened the driver's door and examined the interior, which showed wear patterns consistent with regular use rather than careful preservation. The seats, steering wheel, and pedals all showed signs that someone had driven this car extensively before it was stored. "The interior suggests this car was driven regularly at some point," Maya observed. "Do you have maintenance records that might help me understand what needs attention?" Frank's expression grew more guarded. "I'm afraid I don't have detailed records. I'm hoping you can assess the car's condition and recommend whatever work is necessary to make it roadworthy again." Maya had worked with enough clients to recognize when someone was withholding information, but she had also learned that classic car owners often had personal reasons for being secretive about their vehicle's history. Her policy was to focus on mechanical work and avoid asking questions that clients seemed reluctant to answer. "Mr. Mitchell, I'll need to conduct a comprehensive inspection before I can provide an estimate," Maya explained. "That includes checking the engine, transmission, electrical system, and all safety components. For a car this old, I recommend a complete restoration to ensure reliability and safety." Frank nodded, but his attention seemed focused on something beyond the immediate conversation. Ms. Rodriguez, there's one thing I need to mention. This car is special to me for personal reasons. I'd appreciate it if you could be discreet about any work you do on it. Maya had heard similar requests from clients who own vehicles with complicated histories, divorce settlements, estate disputes, or simply eccentric collectors who preferred privacy. Mr. Mitchell, I guarantee discretion for all my restoration projects. Your car will be worked on personally by me, and I don't discuss my clients' vehicles with anyone. Frank seemed relieved by Maya's assurance. Thank you. I'll leave you to assess the car's condition. Please call me when you have an estimate. As Frank departed in his pickup truck, Maya began her initial examination of the Mustang, starting with the exterior condition and working systematically through every component that would affect the restoration process. The car's paint was faded but original, with no evidence of accident damage or major bodywork. The chrome and stainless steel trim showed surface corrosion typical of long-term storage, but nothing that couldn't be restored to original condition. The tires were obviously old and would need replacement, but the wheels were correct for the vehicle and in good condition. Maya's first surprise came when she examined the car more closely and discovered modifications that were definitely not original equipment. The front and rear bumpers appeared standard, but closer inspection revealed that they were significantly heavier than factory specifications, suggesting some kind of reinforcement or armoring that wasn't visible from normal viewing angles. That's interesting, Maya murmured to herself, making notes on her inspection checklist. Why would someone armor a classic Mustang? She continued her examination, finding additional modifications that seemed inconsistent with civilian use. The suspension had been upgraded with heavy-duty components that would improve performance but weren't typical of restoration projects focused on maintaining original specifications. The exhaust system had been modified to reduce noise output rather than enhance performance, another unusual choice for a muscle car restoration. Maya's mechanical expertise told her that these modifications had been professionally installed by someone with access to specialized equipment and materials. The work quality was exceptional, but the choices reflected priorities that didn't match typical civilian automotive modification patterns. When Maya opened the hood to examine the engine compartment, she discovered the first modification that made her seriously question what kind of vehicle she was dealing with. The engine was the correct 428 cubic inch V8 that belonged in a 1967 Shelby GT500, but had been modified with components that Maya didn't recognize. More concerning, the electrical system included wiring and components that appeared to be communications equipment rather than standard automotive electronics. What the hell? Maya said aloud, studying wiring harnesses that connected to devices mounted in concealed locations throughout the engine compartment. Maya had restored dozens of classic cars, including several that had been modified by previous owners, but she had never encountered communications equipment that appeared to be military specification hardware integrated into a civilian vehicle's electrical system. She followed the wiring from the engine compartment to the interior, where she discovered that the modification work was even more extensive than she had initially realized. Behind the dashboard, beneath the seats, and in the trunk area, someone had installed equipment that looked more appropriate for a military vehicle than a classic muscle car. Maya's growing curiosity about the Mustang's modifications led her to conduct a more detailed examination than she would normally perform during an initial assessment. She wanted to understand what she was dealing with before providing Frank with an estimate for restoration work. That's when she found the hidden compartment. Maya was examining the trunk area to assess the condition of the spare tire well when she noticed that the floor panel didn't sit quite flush with the surrounding metal. Her experience with automotive bodywork told her that someone had modified the trunk to create additional storage space. Using a flashlight to examine the area more carefully, Maya found latches that were concealed but accessible if someone knew where to look. When she opened a hidden compartment, she discovered contents that made her heart race and her hands shake. The compartment contained file folders filled with documents that appeared to be military reports, photographs, and maps related to operations that Maya couldn't immediately understand, but that were clearly classified material. The papers were marked with security classifications that she recognized from movies and television shows, but had never seen in person. Maya's first instinct was to close the compartment and pretend she had never found it, but her curiosity compelled her to examine at least some of the contents to understand what kind of situation she had stumbled into. The documents included mission reports, personnel files, and operational plans that referenced locations and activities that Maya didn't recognize, but that were clearly related to military operations conducted decades earlier. Many of the papers were marked with dates from the 1980s, and several included photographs of military personnel and equipment in what appeared to be combat situations. One file contained personnel records for someone identified as Colonel Franklin D. Mitchell, United States Army Special Operations Command. The photograph attached to the file showed a much younger version of the man who had introduced himself simply as Frank. Maya stared at the photograph and documentation, realizing that her client was apparently a military officer with a service record that included multiple commendations and assignments to classified operations. But more disturbing were documents that suggested Colonel Mitchell had been reported missing in action during an operation in Central America in 1987. "This can't be right," Maya whispered, studying documentation that indicated Frank Mitchell had been declared dead following a mission that had gone wrong 37 years ago. Maya closed the hidden compartment and stepped back from the Mustang, trying to process what she had discovered. Either her client was someone impersonating a dead military officer, or Colonel Frank Mitchell had somehow survived whatever had happened in 1987 and had been living under a different identity for nearly 4 decades. Either possibility suggested that Maya had become involved in something far more complex and potentially dangerous than a routine automotive restoration project. Maya spent the rest of the evening researching what she could find about Colonel Franklin Mitchell, using her computer and internet resources that were available to civilians. What she discovered only deepened the mystery surrounding her unusual client and his modified Mustang. Public records indicated that Colonel Franklin D. Mitchell had indeed been reported missing in action during a classified operation in Nicaragua in 1987. Military records available through veterans databases showed that he had been posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and had been buried with military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, despite the fact that his body had never been recovered. But Maya's client was undoubtedly the same person shown in the military photographs she had found in the Mustang's hidden compartment. The facial features, general build, and distinctive mannerisms were identical, even accounting for 37 years of aging. Maya found news articles from 1987 that described the loss of several special operations personnel during what was officially characterized as a training exercise, though the article suggested that the reality had been more complex than public statements indicated. Colonel Mitchell was mentioned as one of the casualties, with tributes from fellow officers describing him as one of the most capable and decorated soldiers of his generation. The discovery of these records created a dilemma for Maya that went far beyond the complications of an unusual restoration project. If Frank Mitchell was really the military officer who had been declared dead in 1987, his survival and apparent years of living under a different identity raised questions that could have serious legal and national security implications. But Maya also understood that approaching authorities with her discoveries could put both herself and Frank in danger if there were reasons why it remained hidden for nearly 4 decades. Maya decided to continue her examination of the Mustang, hoping to find additional information that would help her understand the situation before making any decisions about how to proceed. Her detailed inspection of the vehicle revealed that the modifications were even more extensive than she had initially realized. The communications equipment integrated into the car's electrical system appeared to be capable of both receiving and transmitting signals across multiple frequency ranges, including some that were restricted for government use. The armor plating that she had discovered in the bumpers extended throughout the vehicle, with ballistic protection integrated into the doors, floor panels, and even the roof structure. The modifications had been done with such skill that they were nearly invisible unless someone knew specifically what to look for. Maya realized that the Mustang had been converted into what was essentially a mobile command and communications center disguised as a civilian vehicle. The work quality and equipment specifications suggested that the modifications had been performed by government agencies with access to classified technology. Her mechanical assessment indicated that despite sitting in use for an extended period, the Mustang was in remarkably good condition. The engine needed basic maintenance, The fuel system required cleaning and several rubber components needed replacement, but the overall condition suggested that the car had been properly prepared for long-term storage. More significantly, Maya discovered that the communications equipment appeared to be functional and might still be capable of connecting to government networks if activated properly. Maya was completing her inspection when she heard vehicles approaching her garage. Through the windows, she could see several black SUVs pulling into her parking area, followed by a sedan that looked suspiciously like an unmarked government vehicle. "This can't be good," Maya muttered, quickly closing the Mustang's hood and moving away from the vehicle as the drivers of the approaching cars exited their vehicles and walked toward her garage. The men approaching her shop wore civilian clothes, but carried themselves with the bearing of law enforcement or military personnel. Their organized approach and obvious coordination suggested that Maya's discovery of the Mustang's secrets had somehow attracted official attention. "Ms. Rodriguez?" said the lead figure, a man in his 40s with graying hair and the kind of intense gaze that Maya associated with federal agents. "I'm Agent Harrison with the Department of Defense. We need to discuss the vehicle you're working on." Maya felt her pulse quicken as she realized that her involvement with Frank Mitchell's Mustang had escalated beyond anything she could have anticipated. "Agent Harrison, I'm not sure what you're referring to. I work on a lot of vehicles." Harrison's expression suggested that he wasn't interested in playing word games. "Ms. Rodriguez, we're here about the 1967 Mustang that was delivered to your shop yesterday evening. We have reason to believe that vehicle contains materials that are relevant to ongoing national security investigations." Maya understood that denying knowledge of the Mustang would be pointless, but she also wasn't sure how much she should reveal about what she had discovered during her inspection. "Agent Harrison, the Mustang is here for restoration work. I've been conducting a standard assessment of its mechanical condition." Harrison nodded, but his attention was clearly focused on gaining access to the vehicle rather than discussing Maya's restoration plans. "Ms. Rodriguez, we're going to need to examine that vehicle immediately. This is a matter of national security." Maya had been expecting this moment since she had discovered the hidden compartment and classified documents. "Agent Harrison, do you have a warrant or legal authorization for search of my client's property?" Harrison's response indicated that the situation was more complex than a standard law enforcement investigation. "Ms. Rodriguez, the vehicle in question contains materials that were reported stolen from a classified government facility. We have authority to recover government property regardless of who currently possesses it." Maya realized that she was caught between competing claims about the Mustang's ownership and contents, with implications that she couldn't fully understand. "Agent Harrison, my client provided clear title documentation for the vehicle. If there are ownership disputes, those should be resolved through appropriate legal channels." Harrison studied Maya's expression, apparently assessing whether she was being deliberately obstructive or simply trying to protect her client's interests. "Ms. Rodriguez, your client may not be who he claims to be. We have reason to believe that the person who brought you this vehicle has been using a false identity for an extended period." Maya felt a mixture of vindication and concern as Harrison's statement confirmed her suspicions about Frank Mitchell's true identity. "Agent Harrison, even if there are questions about my client's identity, I have obligations to protect his property until those questions are resolved through proper legal procedures." Harrison's patience was clearly being tested by Maya's refusal to immediately grant access to the Mustang. "Ms. Rodriguez, I'm trying to handle the situation with minimal disruption to your business, but I can obtain legal authorization for a complete search of your facility if that becomes necessary." Maya understood that Harrison had the authority and resources to search her garage regardless of her cooperation, but she also felt obligated to protect Frank Mitchell until she understood more about the situation. "Agent Harrison, I appreciate your position, but I need to understand what kind of legal exposure I'm facing before I can cooperate with your investigation." Harrison made a decision that suggested he was willing to provide Maya with information that might secure her cooperation. "Ms. Rodriguez, the man who brought you this vehicle is someone we've been trying to locate for several years. The document and equipment in that car could provide answers to questions that have significant national security implications." Maya realized that Harrison was offering her an opportunity to learn more about Frank Mitchell's situation before making irreversible decisions about cooperation. Agent Harrison, what kind of questions are you trying to answer? Harrison glanced around Maya's garage, apparently assessing whether the location was appropriate for sharing sensitive information. Ms. Rodriguez, in 1987, a special operations team was conducting a classified mission in Central America when they encountered a situation that resulted in the loss of several personnel and the compromise of sensitive intelligence materials. We believe your client may have survived that operation and may possess information about what happened to the missing intelligence. Maya understood that Harrison was describing the operation that had resulted in Frank Mitchell being declared dead, but she also realized that there were aspects of the situation that Harrison might not be revealing. Agent Harrison, are you saying my client is a missing soldier who has been presumed dead for 37 years? Harrison's response was careful and measured. Ms. Rodriguez, we're saying that the person who brought you this vehicle may have information that could resolve questions about events that occurred decades ago. Our interest is in understanding what happened and recovering any government materials that may have been compromised. Maya made a decision that would fundamentally change her involvement in the situation surrounding Frank Mitchell and his mysterious Mustang. Agent Harrison, before I can cooperate with your investigation, I need to contact my client and give him an opportunity to respond to your claims about his identity and the vehicle's contents. Harrison's expression suggested that Maya's request was reasonable but potentially problematic. Ms. Rodriguez, contacting your client could compromise our investigation if he decides to disappear rather than answer questions about his identity and activities. Maya understood Harrison's concern, but she also felt obligated to give Frank an opportunity to explain the situation before government agents seized his vehicle and potentially arrested him. Agent Harrison, my client has a right to legal representation and due process. I'm willing to cooperate with your investigation, but I won't participate in ambushing someone who came to me for automotive services. Harrison considered Maya's position, apparently weighing the benefits of her cooperation against the risks of allowing Frank Mitchell to learn about the government's interest in his whereabouts. Ms. Rodriguez, if you contact your client, will you agree to encourage him to cooperate with our investigation rather than attempting to flee or destroy evidence? Maya realized that Harrison was asking her to become an active participant in the government's investigation rather than simply a witness to events beyond her control. Agent Harrison, I'll encourage my client to cooperate with appropriate legal procedures, but I won't try to manipulate him into surrendering his rights or incriminating himself. Harrison nodded, apparently accepting Maya's conditions as reasonable given the circumstances. Ms. Rodriguez, you can contact your client, but we'll need to monitor your communication to ensure that sensitive information isn't compromised. Maya understood that her involvement in the Frank Mitchell situation had transformed her from an innocent bystander into someone whose actions could affect national security investigations. Agent Harrison, I'll call my client now. But I want to make it clear that I expect both his rights and my business interests to be protected regardless of what your investigation reveals. As Maya reached for her phone to contact Frank Mitchell, she realized that the next few hours would determine whether her discovery of the Mustang secrets would lead to resolution of a decades-old mystery or would involve her in complications that could affect the rest of her life. Maya's phone call to Frank Mitchell was brief and tense, conducted under the watchful supervision of Agent Harrison and several other federal agents who had positioned themselves throughout her garage. Frank's response to her explanation of the situation was immediate and decisive. Maya, I need you to listen carefully, Frank said, his voice carrying a tone of authority that she hadn't heard during their previous conversations. The people who are asking about me and the car represent interests that may not be aligned with the truth about what happened in 1987. Before you cooperate with their investigation, there are things you need to understand. Agent Harrison gestured for Maya to put the call on speaker, but she shook her head and continued her private conversation with Frank. Mr. Mitchell, Agent Harrison says you may have information about missing government materials and personnel from an operation that went wrong decades ago. He's asking for your cooperation in resolving questions about what happened. Frank's silence lasted long enough that Maya wondered if the connection had been lost, but when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of decades of hidden truth. Maya, what happened in 1987 wasn't a mission that went wrong. It was a mission that was betrayed from within our own government. The intelligence materials that were lost were actually sold to hostile forces by people who were supposed to be protecting American interests. Maya felt her understanding of the situation shift dramatically as Frank's words revealed complexity that Agent Harrison hadn't mentioned. Mr. Mitchell, are you saying that the missing intelligence was deliberately compromised by American personnel? Frank's response carried the bitterness of someone who had carried explosive secrets for nearly 4 decades. Maya, I survived that operation and spent the next 37 years gathering evidence that proves members of our own government were responsible for the death of my team and the compromise of intelligence that cost American lives in subsequent operations. Maya looked at Agent Harrison, whose expression suggested that Frank's accusations were not entirely unexpected. Mr. Mitchell, Agent Harrison is here with several other agents. They say they want to resolve questions about what happened, but they also claim authority to seize your vehicle and any materials it contains. Frank's reaction was immediate and urgent. Maya, do not let them take that car. The evidence I collected over 37 years is the only proof that can expose the people responsible for betraying American soldiers and compromising national security. Agent Harrison stepped closer to Maya, clearly frustrated by his inability to monitor both sides of the conversation. Ms. Rodriguez, I need to speak with your client directly. These accusations are serious, and they need to be addressed through appropriate channels. Maya relayed Harrison's request, but Frank's response indicated that he didn't trust the official investigation process. Maya, tell Agent Harrison that I'll meet with him, but only in a public location with legal representation present. And the car stays where it is until I'm satisfied that the investigation is legitimate and not another attempt to cover up what happened in 1987. Maya found herself in the position of mediating between Frank Mitchell, who claimed to possess evidence of government corruption, and federal agents who claimed authority to investigate national security matters. Agent Harrison, Mr. Mitchell agrees to meet with you, but he wants legal representation present, and he wants a meeting in a public location. He also insists that the vehicle remains here until the investigation procedures are clarified. Harrison's response indicated that Frank's conditions were problematic for the government's investigation. Ms. Rodriguez, your client is not in a position to dictate terms for this investigation. We have authority to seize materials that may be relevant to national security, and we can obtain legal authorization for any actions that become necessary. Maya realized that the conflict between Frank's demands and the government authority could escalate into a confrontation that might put her business and personal safety at risk. Agent Harrison, I understand your authority, but I also understand that Mr. Mitchell has legal rights that need to be respected. Can we arrange a meeting that satisfies both your investigative needs and his rights to due process? Harrison consulted with other agents before responding to Maya's suggestion. Ms. Rodriguez, we can arrange a meeting with your client, but the vehicle and any materials it contains remain under our custody until questions about their ownership and classification status are resolved. Maya relayed Harrison's offer to Frank, whose response was immediate and non-negotiable. Maya, if they take the car, the evidence disappears forever and the people responsible for betraying my team are never held accountable. I won't let that happen. Maya found herself caught between Frank's determination to protect evidence that he claimed would expose government corruption and Agent Harrison's authority to seize materials that he claimed were relevant to national security. Mr. Mitchell, Agent Harrison says he has legal authority to take the vehicle regardless of your objections. What do you want me to do? Frank's answer would fundamentally change Maya's role in the unfolding investigation. Maya, I'm going to send you information that will help you understand what's really at stake here. Once you see the evidence I collected, you'll understand why the car can't fall into wrong hands. Within minutes of ending her conversation with Frank, Maya received an encrypted email attachment that contained documents, photographs, and audio recordings that provided context for his accusations about the 1987 operation. The materials Frank had sent revealed a conspiracy that extended far beyond a single failed mission. According to his documentation, several high-ranking military and intelligence officials had been selling classified information to foreign governments for years, using special operations missions as cover for their activities. Frank's evidence included recorded conversations, financial records, and correspondence that implicated people who had held senior positions in the Department of Defense and CIA during the 1980s and 1990s. Several of the individuals named in Frank's documentation had gone on to prominent careers in government and private industry. Most damning were audio recordings that captured conversations between American officials and foreign agents discussing the sale of intelligence materials and the elimination of American personnel who had discovered the conspiracy. Maya realized that Frank's claims about betrayal and cover-up were supported by evidence that would be explosive if verified and made public. Agent Harrison, Maya said, looking up from her computer where she had been reviewing Frank's documentation, I think you need to see what Mr. Mitchell has been collecting for the past 37 years. Harrison's expression suggested that he was prepared for Frank's evidence to be more complex than his initial briefing had indicated. Ms. Rodriguez, we're aware that your client claims to possess evidence of wrongdoing by government personnel. We're prepared to investigate any credible allegations, but we also need to ensure that classified materials are handled through appropriate security procedures. Maya understood that Harrison's response was careful and diplomatic, but it didn't address Frank's fundamental concern that the investigation itself might be compromised by people who have been involved in the original conspiracy. Agent Harrison, the evidence Mr. Mitchell has collected suggests that some of the people who would be responsible for investigating his allegations might be the same people who were involved in the original cover-up. Harrison's reaction confirmed Maya's suspicion that the situation was more complex than a straightforward law enforcement investigation. Ms. Rodriguez, allegations of that nature require special handling through channels that can ensure investigative integrity while protecting national security. We can't allow potentially classified materials to be evaluated outside of authorized security procedures. Maya realized that Harrison was describing exactly the kind of official process that Frank believed would result in the suppression of evidence rather than its proper investigation. Agent Harrison, how can Mr. Mitchell be confident that his evidence will be properly investigated rather than buried by the same people he's accusing of corruption? Harrison's answer revealed the fundamental challenge facing any investigation of Frank's allegations. Ms. Rodriguez, the integrity of our investigative process depends on following established procedures and allowing appropriate authorities to evaluate evidence according to legal and security requirements. Your client's concerns about investigative bias can be addressed through proper legal channels. Maya understood that Harrison was offering official assurances that Frank would likely view as inadequate given his experiences and the nature of his allegations. Agent Harrison, I think Mr. Mitchell needs to hear those assurances directly from you. Are you willing to meet with him under conditions that provide legal protections for both sides? Harrison consulted with his colleagues before responding to Maya's suggestion. Ms. Rodriguez, we can arrange a meeting with your client that includes legal representation and appropriate security procedures. However, any evidence or materials that are determined to be classified government property will need to be secured according to national security protocols. Maya relayed Harrison's offer to Frank, whose response indicated that he was willing to consider cooperation if adequate safeguards could be established. Maya, I'll meet with him, but I want independent legal representation, media presence to ensure transparency, and guarantees that any evidence I provide will be investigated by people who were involved in the original events. Harrison's reaction to Frank's conditions suggested that some of them would be problematic for the government's investigation. Ms. Rodriguez, we can accommodate legal representation, but media involvement in a national security investigation is not possible, and we can't guarantee specific personnel assignments for sensitive investigations. Maya found herself negotiating between Frank's demands for transparency and protection and the government's requirements for security and control over sensitive investigations. Agent Harrison, Mr. Mitchell has spent 37 years hiding because he believes people in the government want to silence him. What assurances can you provide that cooperating with your investigation won't put him at risk? Harrison's response was measured, but didn't address the fundamental trust issues that underlay Frank's reluctance to surrender his evidence. Ms. Rodriguez, your client's safety will be protected according to standard witness protection protocols. His evidence will be investigated according to established procedures for handling sensitive materials. Maya realized that the impasse between Frank's demands and the government's procedures might require a different approach that could satisfy both sides' legitimate concerns. Agent Harrison, what if we could arrange for Mr. Mitchell's evidence to be evaluated by independent experts who could verify its authenticity and significance before it's turned over to government investigators? Harrison's consideration of Maya's suggestion indicated that creative solutions might be possible if they could address security concerns while providing Frank with confidence that his evidence would be properly handled. Ms. Rodriguez, we might be able to work with independent verification, but any process would need to ensure that classified materials are protected and that investigative integrity is maintained. Maya's role as an intermediary between Frank and Agent Harrison had evolved into something approaching diplomatic negotiation between parties whose mutual distrust threatened to prevent resolution of questions that had significant national security implications. The restored Mustang sat in the center of Maya's garage, its hidden compartments containing evidence that could either expose decades of government corruption or compromise ongoing national security investigations, depending on whose version of events was accurate. Maya realized that her decision to examine the car thoroughly had transformed her from an automotive restoration specialist into a key figure in resolving one of the most sensitive investigations in recent government history. The next few hours would determine whether Frank Mitchell's 37 years of hidden evidence would finally be revealed, or whether the secrets buried in the classic Mustang would remain hidden forever. The meeting that would determine Frank Mitchell's fate and the disposition of his evidence was arranged the following morning at the Phoenix Federal Building, with security measures that reflected the sensitive nature of the allegations and materials involved. Maya found herself accompanying Frank not as his attorney, but as the person whose discovery of the Mustang's contents had precipitated the government's investigation. Frank arrived at the federal building accompanied by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a former military JAG officer who specialized in national security law and who had agreed to represent him after reviewing preliminary evidence of his claims. Maya was struck by how different Frank appeared when he was no longer hiding his true identity. His military bearing was unmistakable, and his confidence suggested someone who had spent decades preparing for this moment. Maya, Frank said as they waited in the building's secure conference room, I want you to understand that what happens here today will determine whether the truth about 1987 gets revealed or gets buried for another generation. Agent Harrison entered the conference room accompanied by several other federal officials, including representatives from the Department of Defense, CIA, and Justice Department, who would be responsible for evaluating Frank's evidence and allegations. Colonel Mitchell, Harrison began, using Frank's military rank for the first time. We appreciate your willingness to meet with us. As we've discussed, we need to understand what happened in 1987 and what materials you may have in your possession. Frank's response was direct and comprehensive, providing the first official account of events that had been classified for 37 years. Agent Harrison, in 1987, I was commanding a special operations team conducting intelligence gathering in Nicaragua when we discovered that our mission had been compromised by someone with access to our operational plans. My team was ambushed by forces that had detailed knowledge of our objectives, timeline, and extraction procedures. Frank continued his account, describing how he had survived the ambush that killed most of his team and had subsequently discovered evidence that the mission had been betrayed by American personnel who were selling intelligence to hostile governments. After the ambush, I spent 6 months gathering evidence that proved the compromise had come from within our own command structure. When I attempted to report what I had discovered, I was told that my findings were classified and that pursuing the investigation would compromise national security. Frank's description of his attempts to expose the conspiracy revealed a pattern of obstruction and intimidation that had convinced him to disappear rather than risk being silenced permanently. When it became clear that official channels were controlled by the same people who had betrayed my team, I made the decision to go underground and spend as long as necessary gathering evidence that could eventually expose the conspiracy. Agent Harrison's questions revealed that the government had been aware of Frank's survival for several years and had been attempting to locate him to resolve questions about the 1987 operation. Colonel Mitchell, we've had reports of someone matching your description conducting surveillance and investigation activities related to former military and intelligence personnel. Were those activities part of your evidence gathering? Frank's admission that he had spent decades tracking the careers and activities of people he suspected of involvement in conspiracy demonstrated the scope of his investigation. Agent Harrison, I've documented the activities of 17 individuals who I believe were involved in selling intelligence to foreign governments during the 1980s and 1990s. Several of those individuals achieved senior positions in government and private industry, which enabled them to continue compromising American security interests. Dr. Walsh intervened to ensure that Frank's admissions didn't provide grounds for criminal charges related to surveillance activities. Agent Harrison, my client's investigation was motivated by his desire to expose threats to national security that weren't being addressed through official channels. His methods may have been unorthodox, but his objectives were entirely consistent with his oath to protect American interests. The federal officials present began reviewing the evidence that Frank had brought to the meeting, including documents, recordings, and financial records that supported his allegations about the 1987 betrayal and subsequent cover-up. Maya watched as government investigators examined materials that Frank had risked his life to collect over nearly 4 decades. The evidence was extensive and detailed, including recorded conversations that implicated people in sensitive government positions and financial documentation that traced payments from foreign intelligence services to American officials. Colonel Mitchell, said Deputy Attorney General Robert Chen, who was leading the Justice Department's evaluation of Frank's evidence, if these allegations are accurate, they represent one of the most serious breaches of national security in American history. Frank's response reflected the weight of carrying explosive secrets for 37 years. Mr. Chun, the people responsible for betraying my team and selling American intelligence are still alive, and some of them still hold positions where they can continue to damage American security interests. The evidence I've collected can expose them, but only if it's investigated by people who weren't involved in the original conspiracy. Chen's assurance that the investigation would be conducted with appropriate independence and oversight seemed to address Frank's primary concern about investigative bias. Colonel Mitchell, this investigation will be handled by personnel who weren't involved in the events you're describing, and will implement safeguards to ensure that evidence isn't suppressed or misdirected. Maya realized that the meeting had reached a point where Frank would need to decide whether to trust the government's assurances or continue hiding evidence that could potentially expose decades of corruption. Frank's decision came after consulting privately with Dr. Walsh about the legal protections and guarantees that could be established for his cooperation. Mr. Chun, Frank said, returning to the conference table with a resolve that had been building for 37 years. I'll provide you with everything I've collected, but I have 3 non-negotiable conditions. The room fell silent as Frank outlined his terms. First, I want a written guarantee that this investigation will be conducted by a special prosecutor with no ties to the Defense Department or CIA personnel from the 1980s. Second, I want protection from Ms. Rodriguez, who stumbled into the situation through no fault of her own. And third, I want a commitment that the findings will be made public once the investigation is complete. Deputy Attorney General Chun exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding. Colonel Mitchell, we can accommodate the first 2 conditions. The third will depend on what the investigation reveals and national security considerations. Frank looked at Maya, then back at Chun. That's not acceptable. The American people have a right to know when their government betrays its own soldiers. Dr. Walsh leaned forward. Perhaps we can arrange for declassified summaries to be released with appropriate redactions for ongoing security concerns. After 2 hours of negotiation, they reached an agreement. Frank would surrender all his evidence to an independent special prosecutor. Maya would be placed in witness protection until the investigation concluded, and a public report would be issued within 18 months. 6 months later, Maya stood in the garage of her new shop in Denver, watching as Frank, now open to using his real name and rank, signed the paperwork for the fully restored Mustang. The investigation had moved swiftly once Frank's evidence was authenticated. 17 former government officials had been arrested, including 2 who still held advisory positions. The scandal had rocked Washington and led to congressional hearings on oversight of classified operations. You know, Maya, Frank said, running his hand along the Mustang's gleaming hood, this car was supposed to be my getaway vehicle if I ever got cornered. I never thought it would be the vehicle that finally let me come home. The hidden compartments had been removed and the military equipment safely extracted, but Frank had insisted that Maya complete the restoration. The car now looked exactly as it had when it rolled off the Shelby assembly line in 1967, with one exception, a small brass plaque on the dashboard that read, "For those who left a trace. FM, what will you do now?" Maya asked, wiping her hands on a familiar worn rag. Frank smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression she'd ever seen on his face. "I think I'll take a long drive. Maybe see some of the country I spent 37 years protecting from the shadows." Agent Harrison, who had been cleared of any involvement in the original conspiracy and had actually become an ally during the investigation, approached them. "Colonel, the Justice Department wanted me to thank you formally for your service to the country. Both the service that was recognized and the service that had to remain hidden." Frank nodded, then turned to Maya. "And Ms. Rodriguez, you've got quite a reputation now. The mechanic who helped expose the biggest government conspiracy in modern history. I hear you've got a waiting list of clients who want you to restore their cars." Maya laughed. "Funny thing is, none of them have hidden compartments full of classified documents. Turns out most people just want their classic cars to run well and look good." As Frank drove away in the restored Mustang, Maya watched the Highland Green car disappear into the Denver traffic. She thought about the chain of events that started with a routine restoration job and ended with justice for soldiers who had been betrayed nearly 4 decades ago. Her phone buzzed with text from a new client asking about restoring a 1969 Camaro. Maya smiled and typed back a response. "I specialize in bringing old cars back to life. No secrets required, just patience and attention to detail." The late afternoon sun streamed to the garage windows, illuminating the workspace where Rodriguez Classic Auto would continue the family tradition of automotive restoration. Maya picked up her tools and walked toward her next project, knowing that sometimes the most important discoveries come from simply doing good work with careful attention to what others might overlook. In Washington, the congressional hearings continued, but Frank Mitchell was finally free to live openly under his own name. The evidence he'd preserved in a classic Mustang had not only vindicated his fallen teammates, but it helped ensure that such betrayals would be much harder to hide in the future. The car had served its purpose. The truth had finally come to light, and Maya Rodriguez had learned that sometimes the most valuable restorations aren't just about bringing machines back to life. They're about bringing the truth back from the shadows where it had been hidden for far too long. The end. Thank you for watching Those Who Left a Trace. If this story of courage, persistence, and the power of truth moved you, please subscribe and share it with others who believe that some secrets are too important to stay buried. Remember, the greatest discoveries often come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the people who change history are the ones who simply refuse to look the way when they uncover something that doesn't belong.